Most people say they want freedom. They repeat the word as if repetition might make it true. Freedom of speech, freedom of choice, freedom of identity, freedom of expression. But Erich Fromm saw what most refuse to see. People do not really want freedom. They want relief. Relief from responsibility. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from the burden of choosing who they are. Freedom is not rejected because it is unavailable. It is rejected because it is too demanding. To be free is not to do whatever you want. That fantasy belongs to adolescence. Real freedom is far heavier. It means your life is no longer explained by circumstance, no longer excused by authority, no longer justified by ideology, no longer softened by collective guilt. If you are free, your failures are yours, your emptiness is yours, your cowardice is yours, your unlived life is yours. And that is intolerable for most people, so they seek escape, not from oppression, but from themselves. Fromm understood that modern man does not flee freedom by force. He flees it voluntarily. He runs toward systems, identities, movements, roles, anything that tells him who to be, what to believe, how to think, and who to blame. Not because he is weak, but because freedom strips him naked. It removes the shelter of everyone else. It removes the comfort of belonging without effort. It removes the safety of borrowed meaning. Freedom demands that you author your life without a script. Most people would rather be directed. This is why submission is so seductive. Not submission to tyrants, submission to structure, to routine, to ideology, to moral consensus, to cultural scripts that say, do this, think this, want this, and you are good. That promise is irresistible to the anxious psyche. Fromm called this escape from freedom. Not escape into chains, but escape into certainty. Certainty feels like safety. Certainty feels like meaning. Certainty feels like being held. Freedom feels like standing alone in an open field with no instructions and no guarantees. So most people choose to be told who they are. They adopt identities pre-packaged by culture. They inherit opinions rather than forge them. They cling to causes not because they've examined them, but because they provide belonging. Belonging is easier than becoming. And this is the paradox Fromm exposes. The more a person claims to value freedom, the more likely they are avoiding it. They confuse choice with freedom. But choice without responsibility is just consumption. They confuse expression with freedom, but expression without self-knowledge is just noise. They confuse rebellion with freedom, but rebellion that follows a crowd is still obedience. True freedom is rare because it demands inner authority, and inner authority is frightening. It means you cannot outsource your conscience. You cannot hide behind moral trends. You cannot dissolve into the collective when things go wrong. You must answer for your life. Most people do not want to answer. They want to be told. This is why authoritarian structures reappear endlessly in new forms, not because people are forced into them, but because they relieve anxiety. They remove ambiguity. They simplify the world. They assign blame. They define enemies. They offer identity. And identity without effort is intoxicating. Freedom, by contrast, offers nothing but possibility. Possibility is terrifying, because possibility means failure is real. Mistakes are real. Regret is real. Wasted potential is real. If this content making sense to you, subscribe to the channel, and thank you for your support. Freedom makes your life personal, and most people would rather live impersonally, as functions, roles, demographics, followers. Fromm saw that modern societies would not need to crush dissent. They would drown it in comfort, belonging, and moral reassurance. People would police themselves, monitor each other, punish deviation, not out of cruelty but out of fear. Fear of standing alone, fear of being wrong, fear of losing belonging. Freedom threatens belonging. So belonging is chosen over freedom, again and again. People say they want autonomy, but panic when no authority validates their choices. They say they want authenticity, but feel lost without external approval. They say they want truth, but become hostile when truth destabilizes their identity. So they retreat into slogans, into tribes, into certainty. Fromm's insight is devastating because it removes the villain. There is no oppressor to overthrow if the prison is psychological. There is no tyrant to blame if submission is voluntary. The chains are internal and the door is open, but most people will not walk out because outside the prison of certainty is freedom, and freedom does not promise comfort. It promises responsibility. The most effective chains are invisible. They don't rattle. They don't bruise. They don't feel like chains at all. They feel like relief. Relief from thinking. Relief from choosing. Relief from carrying the weight of one's own life. Fromm understood that obedience is not imposed on the modern individual. It is desired. Because obedience offers something freedom never does: psychological shelter. When you obey a system, an ideology, a movement, a moral consensus, you are no longer alone with your decisions. Your choices are pre-validated. Your failures are pre-explained. Your guilt is pre-distributed. You are safe, not from danger, but from accountability. This is why people cling to ideologies with such ferocity, not because they are rational, but because they relieve anxiety. An ideology tells you who is good and who is evil, what to think and what to reject, what is permitted and what is forbidden. It replaces inner authority with external certainty, and certainty is addictive. Freedom requires ambiguity. It forces you to live without final answers, to act without guarantees, to stand without applause. Most people cannot tolerate this, so they trade freedom for structure and call it morality. Fromm saw that moral outrage is often a substitute for moral courage. It is easier to condemn others than to confront oneself. It is easier to fight symbolic enemies than to wrestle with one's own emptiness. It is easier to repeat the right opinions than to risk forming real ones. This is how submission disguises itself as virtue. People do not submit because they are coerced. They submit because submission feels righteous, and righteousness is intoxicating. It gives meaning without effort, belonging without intimacy, identity without individuation. You don't have to know who you are if your group tells you. You don't have to think if your ideology thinks for you. You don't have to face your contradictions if your side is right. This is why people defend systems that diminish them, because those systems protect them from the terror of self-authorship. If this content making sense to you, subscribe to the channel, and thank you for your support. Freedom would require them to admit that their lives are smaller than they could be. Obedience allows them to believe that smallness is moral. Masculinity collapses under this pressure, not because men are inherently weak, but because modern culture trains them to avoid risk. Risk of being wrong, risk of being isolated, risk of being judged, risk of standing alone. So men learn to perform agreement, to blend in, to suppress dissent, to outsource judgment. They become socially compliant while telling themselves they are independent. But independence without responsibility is illusion. Fromm saw that people do not fear tyranny, they fear freedom. Tyranny removes choice, freedom demands it. Tyranny tells you what to do. Freedom asks you who you are, and that question is unbearable to a self that has never been cultivated. So people seek leaders, movements, narratives that promise certainty, not because they want to be dominated, but because they want to stop feeling lost. This is why people defend their chains, because without them, they would have to face the silence, and silence is where freedom begins. But silence is also where anxiety lives, so the modern individual stays loud, opinionated, engaged, outraged, anything to avoid the quiet moment where no one is telling them what to think. Fromm's insight exposes a brutal truth. People do not want liberation. They want belonging with permission. They want to feel part of something larger without taking responsibility for themselves. They want freedom in language, but obedience in practice. And when someone actually lives freely, thinks independently, refuses ideological comfort, accepts personal responsibility, they are treated as a threat. not because they are dangerous, but because they expose the lie. They reveal that submission was optional, and that realization is unbearable to those who chose it, so they attack the free individual. They label him immoral, irresponsible, extreme, problematic, anything to avoid asking the question, why didn't I choose freedom? Fromm understood that the tragedy of modern man is not oppression. It is voluntary abdication. The abandonment of freedom not under threat, but under comfort. And the deeper the comfort, the stronger the attachment to the cage. Freedom does not feel liberating at first. It feels like anxiety. This is the part Fromm understood that most philosophers avoided saying out loud. Freedom does not arrive as joy. It arrives as groundlessness. When external authority falls away, when ideology no longer speaks for you, when consensus no longer shields you, you are left alone with yourself. And that encounter is not pleasant. There is no script, no reassurance, no collective guilt to hide behind, no one to blame when things go wrong. Only you. Your choices, your limits, your fears, your responsibility. This is why most people flee freedom permanently. Not because they tried it and failed, but because they sensed what it would demand and turned away before the cost became explicit. Freedom requires psychological adulthood. It requires the ability to tolerate anxiety without immediately numbing it, to endure uncertainty without demanding resolution, to stand alone without converting solitude into resentment. Most people never develop this capacity, so when freedom appears, they experience it as threat. They feel exposed, ungrounded, unprotected, and they run back to whatever offers structure. Authority, identity, moral certainty, tribe. Fromm saw that people do not merely submit, they cling. They cling to systems that diminish them, because those systems keep existential dread at bay. Freedom asks the one question most people spend their lives avoiding. What are you doing with your life? And why? That question has no collective answer. And without a collective answer, most people collapse. They confuse freedom with chaos because they have never cultivated inner order. They confuse autonomy with isolation because they have never learned how to stand alone. They confuse responsibility with cruelty because they were taught that accountability is punishment. So they flee, and over time, they forget what they fled from. They convince themselves that submission is maturity, that obedience is morality, that conformity is safety. They build identities around their chains and defend them with passion. Not because they love the chains, but because without them, they would have to face the void. Fromm understood that the modern individual does not need to be dominated. He needs to be distracted, given comfort, given certainty, given moral reassurance, enough to keep him from asking why his life feels small, and when his unease surfaces as anxiety, depression, restlessness, it is treated as pathology, something to medicate, to manage, to soothe, anything but interpret it as a signal, because that unease is not a defect, it is the cost of avoided freedom. The anxiety people feel is not evidence they are unwell, it is evidence they are unlived. Freedom produces anxiety only when one has not developed the inner strength to hold it. And strength is not given. It is built through confrontation, through choosing when it is easier not to, through standing without approval, through tolerating misunderstanding, through bearing the weight of one's own failures without collapsing into blame. Very few people are willing to do this, so they live as fragments, partially responsible, partially alive, partially free. They talk about freedom abstractly while organizing their lives around comfort. They celebrate autonomy rhetorically while obeying silently, and they resent those who remind them of the difference. Because the truly free individual does not accuse, he merely exists, and that existence is unbearable to those who surrendered their freedom voluntarily. Fromm's insight leaves us with no villain and no excuse, no tyrant to overthrow, no system to blame, only a question: what if the cage is open? And most people simply refuse to leave, not because they are forced to stay, but because outside the cage there is no one to tell them who they are. Freedom offers no comfort, only truth, and truth is heavy. That is why most people will continue to say they want freedom while choosing everything that prevents it. And that is why freedom will remain rare, not forbidden, just unwanted.